I came to house sit, then I found her note, "Make yourself comfortable," in my room. The car door clicked shut, and the quiet of the suburban street pressed in around me. I had come to house sit for her, a simple favor that felt like stepping into someone else's world for a few days. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. My bag felt heavier than usual as I walked up the path to her front door, each step echoing slightly on the wooden boards. This wasn't just a house I'd been entrusted with, it was her home. And that added weight, subtle but undeniable, settled in my chest. The first thing I noticed was a small note taped to the door, handwritten in neat, flowing letters that immediately suggested a personal touch. I reached out, hesitating for a second, my fingers brushing the paper lightly. The words were simple, almost casual: "Make yourself comfortable, in my room." My eyes lingered on them longer than necessary, and a strange mixture of curiosity and hesitation stirred inside me. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, just intriguing. The ellipsis made it feel like an invitation, an open-ended suggestion I wasn't quite sure how to respond to. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot greeting me like an old secret. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, a combination that was at once grounding and intimate. I could almost imagine her presence still lingering in the space, the way her perfume might cling to the corners, the soft echo of footsteps in rooms she had just left. I exhaled slowly, telling myself this was just a house, nothing more, yet my chest still felt tight in a way that suggested otherwise. I set my bag down and let my gaze wander. The living room was cozy and lived in, books stacked in uneven towers, a soft throw draped across the couch, photographs of people laughing pinned to a corkboard. It was subtle, but there was a rhythm to the place, a kind of warmth that made me want to settle in, even if it felt a little daring. And then my eyes returned to the note, imagining the hand that had written it, the voice that had left it behind. Why her room? Was it a test? A joke? Or something more? For a moment, I just stood there, fingers tracing the edge of the note absent-mindedly. The handwriting felt familiar in a strange way, confident yet intimate, like it carried a piece of her with it. I could almost smell the faint trace of her perfume on the paper, subtle, clean, not overpowering but unmistakable. My pulse ticked up slightly, not with fear, not with expectation exactly, but with awareness of something quietly shifting, the edges of ordinary reality softening just enough to make me pause. I finally moved toward the stairs, each step deliberate, slow. My hand brushed along the railing, the polished wood cool under my palm. Upstairs, the hallway stretched out before me, doors closed and silent, waiting. And then there it was, her room. I stood just outside, taking a breath, the note still vivid in my mind. Every instinct told me to step inside, yet hesitation lingered, delicious and electric, like the calm before a storm. Somewhere deep down, I realized I was not just entering her room. I was stepping into a space she had shaped, a space that carried her essence, and perhaps, a space that might change the rhythm of my heart, quietly, irreversibly. I finally pushed the door open, and the room greeted me with the quiet intimacy of someone else's private world. The air smelled faintly of her perfume again, soft and lingering, wrapping around me like a whisper. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting warm, golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The space felt lived in yet carefully curated, books stacked in thoughtful piles, a scarf draped over a chair, and a vase with a single bloom on the windowsill. Every detail whispered her presence, and I couldn't help but notice the gentle rhythm of her life that had already imprinted itself on the room. I stepped further inside, setting my bag down by the bed. My fingers brushed over the edge of the dresser absent-mindedly, tracing the smooth varnish, feeling the warmth where her hands might have rested just moments ago. It was an intimate sensation, subtle but stirring, and I found myself pausing, taking in the quiet tension that had begun to coil in my chest. And then she appeared. Not a shadow, not a sudden movement, but her presence, steady and confident, as if she had been there all along. She wore something casual, comfortable, yet it accentuated a quiet elegance I couldn't ignore. There was an ease to her posture, a grace in the way she moved, and yet beneath it lingered a faint vulnerability, subtle, like the tremor in a note held too long. I felt my pulse shift, faster, awareness sharpening, every detail of her amplified, the curve of her smile, the warmth in her gaze, the way her hand rested lightly on the edge of the dresser. We didn't speak at first. Instead, there was an exchange that required no words, a glance held just a beat too long, a smile that lingered, fingers brushing ever so slightly as she reached past me to adjust a book. The touch was light, accidental, or so it seemed, but it carried a weight I couldn't quite measure. My chest tightened, not with fear, not with lust, but with something quieter, something intimate and unspoken. I didn't expect anyone to follow the note, she said finally, her voice low and warm, threading through the room like a melody. Neither did I admitted, letting my own voice sound calmer than I felt. I noticed the way her eyes softened, the tilt of her head, the small, almost imperceptible pause before she spoke again. It wasn't just curiosity in her gaze, it was a quiet invitation, a subtle acknowledgement that this space, this moment, was ours alone. She leaned slightly against the dresser, a casual movement that somehow drew me closer without words, the air between us charged with small, deliberate intimacies. My fingers grazed a stack of papers, her hand almost brushing mine again, and I realized how aware I had become of her presence, of the way the room, and her, felt alive around me. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to feel it fully, the tension of proximity, the pull of quiet attraction, the sense that something unspoken had begun to settle between us. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't demanding, it was simply there, lingering in the space we shared, a warmth that made the room feel smaller, closer, almost protective. I exhaled slowly, noticing the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the sunlight, the quiet sounds of the house outside, and the weight of anticipation pressing gently against my chest. For the first time, I understood what the note had meant, not just an invitation to sit, to stay, but to step into a world she had created, and perhaps, into a connection that was quietly, irresistibly beginning. The next morning, the house felt different somehow, softer, almost alive with possibility. Sunlight spilled through the windows, falling across the worn wooden floors and illuminating the small corners of her world I had yet to notice. I wandered into the kitchen, the faint aroma of coffee drifting from a neglected pot on the counter, and she was there, already moving with quiet purpose, her presence filling the space without effort. "Good morning," she said, voice low and calm, yet carrying that warmth that made the ordinary feel intimate. Her eyes caught mine, a slow smile spreading across her face that held something teasing, something unspoken. I smiled back, my chest tightening slightly at the gentle curve of her lips, the way her hair fell naturally around her shoulders. We made coffee together, a simple ritual, but even the mundane felt charged with a subtle tension. Hands brushed as we reached for mugs, a faint, lingering contact that made my pulse jump. She didn't pull away, letting the moment stretch, letting it exist without comment. There was no rush, no urgency, just quiet awareness of each other, and the growing comfort that came from proximity. Conversation flowed easily, soft and meandering. We laughed over minor mishaps, spilled sugar, a crooked picture frame, our voices mingling, the sound intimate and familiar in the way it filled the room. Her laughter was light, almost musical, brushing against me like a gentle caress. I found myself drawn to the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled with amusement, and I realized that every movement, every small gesture, was slowly anchoring me to her presence. At one point, I reached for a book she had left on the counter, and our fingers touched briefly. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet I felt a jolt run up my arm. She glanced at me, a slight, knowing smile playing at the edge of her lips, and I felt that quiet thrill again, the awareness that our connection was no longer just emotional, but subtly physical too. It was a brush of skin, a warmth shared in silence, a tiny affirmation that we existed in the same space in a way that mattered. Later, we found ourselves in the living room, sitting a little too close on the couch, shoulders occasionally brushing, knees almost touching. The afternoon sunlight streamed in, painting golden streaks across the room, and every subtle touch seemed amplified in the warmth. I noticed the softness of her sweater under my fingers when we adjusted our positions, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the air, and the way her gaze lingered longer than necessary, creating a magnetic pull I could neither resist nor fully understand. We spoke about books, music, and the small details of our lives, the things that usually didn't matter much to anyone else, but now felt important, meaningful. Our conversation was gentle, flowing, and intimate, carrying an undercurrent of flirtation that was never spoken but always present. Every smile, every pause, every brush of hands seemed deliberate, a slow, quiet dance that neither of us wanted to end. By the time the afternoon waned into evening, a comfortable tension had settled between us. It was not the fevered rush of desire but a patient, simmering anticipation, the kind that makes every glance and every touch feel electric. And in that space, in that room, surrounded by sunlight and the soft rhythm of shared presence, I realized that the house-sitting was no longer just a favor. It had become the start of something delicate, charged, and quietly inevitable. That evening, the house seemed to exhale a quiet calm, the way only familiar spaces can. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the soft hum of distant traffic carried a rhythm that felt oddly soothing. We had moved to the living room after dinner, lingering with mugs of tea in hand, the air thick with an unspoken intimacy that neither of us had yet fully acknowledged. She shifted on the couch, curling her legs beneath her, and I found myself noticing the subtle grace in her movements, the way her shoulders relaxed when she felt at ease. There was a quiet strength in her, yet beneath it, I sensed vulnerability, small fissures that showed only in fleeting expressions, in the tilt of her head, in the brief pauses before her words. I realized I wanted to understand those fissures, to be the one she could trust without hesitation. "You know," she said softly, her eyes focused on the warm glow of the lamp beside her, "it's strange, letting someone into your space like this." Her voice carried a trace of hesitation, a thread of openness that made the room feel smaller, closer. "You never know how much of yourself you're really revealing." I listened, leaning slightly closer, feeling the quiet pull of her presence. "I get that," I said, my tone gentle, deliberate. "It's easier to hide behind routines, behind walls. But sometimes, it's worth risking a little. You feel things more fully that way." Our eyes met, and in that gaze was an acknowledgement that went beyond words. There was trust here, fragile but growing, a willingness to share without expectation, to be seen in a way that felt raw and real. I felt my own defenses soften, the quiet hesitancy in my chest giving way to a desire for closeness, not the kind that could be rushed, but the kind that could be savored. She reached for her tea, fingers brushing mine as our hands passed. The contact was light, accidental, or so it seemed, but it sent a subtle warmth racing through my arm. I noticed how her eyes flicked toward mine, a flicker of awareness, and then she smiled, just slightly, just enough to make my pulse catch. The room seemed to shrink around us, the world outside fading until it was just the two of us, suspended in quiet connection. "I guess I've been protective of this space," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "Not because it's mine, but because letting someone in makes it vulnerable. Makes me vulnerable." She paused, taking a slow sip of tea, and I felt the weight of her words settle in the air. It wasn't a confession of longing, at least not yet, but a quiet invitation for understanding, a gentle hand extended in trust. Without thinking, I reached out and lightly rested my hand near hers on the armrest, close enough to feel the faint heat of her skin without overt intrusion. She didn't pull away, instead, she let the touch linger for a heartbeat, small but meaningful. There was no rush, no expectation, just the subtle acknowledgement that connection was forming, slowly, carefully, tenderly. The evening passed in a soft rhythm of conversation and quiet laughter, moments punctuated by gentle glances, lingering touches, and a growing sense of ease. By the time we finally moved toward the bedrooms, the unspoken understanding had settled, the attraction between us wasn't just physical or fleeting. It was deeper, grounded in trust, vulnerability, and the quiet thrill of being truly seen by someone who mattered. For the first time since arriving, I felt that the house-sitting wasn't just a task or a favor, it was a step into something far more delicate, far more human, and infinitely more compelling than I had anticipated. That evening, the house seemed to hum with quiet expectation. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving a soft wash of twilight across the room. Lamps cast gentle pools of light, shadows stretching lazily along the walls, and the air carried a warmth that made the ordinary feel suspended in anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside, seemed amplified, as if the house itself was attuned to the growing tension between us. We found ourselves in the living room again, drawn there without planning it. The couch felt too small for the space we now shared, and yet we didn't move apart. Her shoulder occasionally brushed mine, light contact that sent a quiet ripple through me each time. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warmth of the room, a subtle, constant reminder of her presence. My pulse quickened, but it wasn't a frantic, urgent beat. It was measured, simmering, electric in its restraint. We talked about small things, music, books, trivial moments from our day. But beneath every word was a rhythm of unspoken tension. The glances lingered, the smiles were quieter yet loaded with meaning, and the brush of our hands became more frequent, more deliberate, even if neither of us fully acknowledged it. Every minor contact felt magnified, a hand passing near hers, knees brushing lightly, fingers accidentally grazing a book she reached for. It was all subtle, fleeting, yet charged in a way that made the ordinary feel profoundly intimate. She laughed at a joke I made, and I found myself captivated by the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the gentle tilt of her head, the ease of her smile. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward her, the urge to close the physical distance, but I resisted. There was a careful dance unfolding, a slow negotiation between desire and restraint. The tension wasn't about rushing, it was about noticing, savoring, and letting the connection deepen naturally. At one point, I adjusted a cushion beside her, my hand brushing hers in the process. She didn't flinch, instead, her fingers lingered close to mine, a heartbeat of acknowledgement. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, subtle but undeniable, and I realized that the quiet desire simmering between us was now mutual, a tension that neither of us wanted to name yet. The way she moved in the room, her casual gestures, the slight rise and fall of her chest as she laughed softly, all of it seemed magnified, as if each moment were deliberately drawn out to heighten awareness. I caught her gaze once, and the room seemed to shrink around us. There was longing there, unspoken and carefully measured, mirrored by a hesitation in my own eyes. We settled into a companionable silence, letting the tension hum between us. Her hand rested near mine, not quite touching, yet close enough that I could feel the warmth through the space between us. Every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale, the gentle brush of her sweater against my arm, amplified the quiet, simmering energy in the room. It was a tension neither of us wanted to resolve quickly. By the time the evening drew toward night, it was clear that the slow-burn attraction had deepened into something undeniable. It wasn't about words or declarations. It was in the silences, the glances, the lingering touches that carried meaning beyond the mundane. The house, the room, and the moments we shared had become a crucible for this quiet desire, a tension that promised intimacy, trust, and connection, but only if we allowed it to unfold at its own pace. By the following evening, the tension between us had settled into something tender, almost comforting. The house had grown quieter, the outside world fading into the background, leaving only the soft hum of lamps and the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We had moved into the living room again, drawn to its warmth and the familiarity it now carried, and I could feel the gravity of what had been building between us, the subtle, unspoken pull that neither of us had tried to rush, yet neither could ignore. She sat close enough that the edge of her sweater brushed my arm, a sensation that sent a quiet thrill through me. I noticed it immediately, the softness of the fabric, the faint warmth radiating from her skin, and I felt my hand inch subtly toward hers. There was no hurry, no sudden movement, just the careful intention of proximity. Our eyes met, and in that gaze, I saw the acknowledgement of what had been simmering, attraction, yes, but also trust, curiosity, and a quiet desire to be closer without crossing lines that neither of us wanted to breach. "I enjoy having you here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. More than I thought I would. I smiled, letting the words linger between us. I feel the same, I admitted, my tone careful, deliberate. It's different, in a good way. Comfortable, but also charged. I've never felt something like this before. She shifted slightly, leaning toward me just a fraction, and I felt the heat of her presence intensify. The pause that followed was deliberate, an unspoken conversation carried entirely in stillness. My fingers brushed hers as I reached for my cup, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let the contact linger for a heartbeat, small but meaningful, the kind of touch that could carry entire conversations in silence. I think, she said after a moment, that I've been waiting for this, someone who notices the quiet things, who doesn't rush, who sees me as I am. Her eyes softened, and I could see the vulnerability hidden behind her confident exterior. It was a side of her I hadn't glimpsed fully before, and it made the connection feel infinitely deeper, infinitely more human. I placed my hand over hers, letting the warmth settle between us, grounding the moment in something tangible. Her fingers flexed lightly under mine, a subtle acknowledgement of trust, and I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of anticipation and contentment. For a few moments, we simply sat there, the weight of the day and the tension that had been building dissolving into a quiet sense of closeness. Finally, she leaned in, resting her head gently against my shoulder. The motion was soft, unassuming, yet it carried an intimacy that words could never capture. I felt the rise and fall of her breath, the warmth of her cheek, and the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat as it pressed softly against my chest. There was no rush, no expectation, just the mutual understanding that this moment, and these feelings, were ours to nurture carefully. In that quiet connection, I realized the slow-burn attraction had transformed. It was no longer just tension or curiosity, it was trust, desire, and emotional intimacy intertwined, a foundation for something deep and meaningful. And in the calm of the room, with the house around us echoing with quiet familiarity, I knew we had crossed a threshold, the point where attraction became connection, and connection promised something lasting, gentle, and profoundly human. The house had settled into a gentle quiet by the time night fully embraced the world outside. The soft glow of the lamps cast pools of light across the living room, and the muted hum of the night, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, a faint wind, made the space feel like a private sanctuary. It was just the two of us now, the tension that had simmered for days transformed into a gentle warmth, a quiet connection neither of us felt the need to rush. We lingered on the couch, comfortably close. Shoulders brushed lightly, and every so often our hands touched, fleeting, almost accidental, but each contact carried a weight that made my chest tighten in the most pleasant way. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft warmth of the room, and it was grounding, comforting, familiar. Every glance, every smile, every shared silence seemed amplified, charged with the intimacy we had slowly nurtured over the past days. I never realized how much a space could feel alive, I said softly, my hand brushing against hers once more, letting the touch linger a heartbeat longer than necessary. Yours has this quiet warmth. Like it's holding me here, and somehow, holding us together. She smiled, a gentle curve that reached her eyes, and leaned slightly toward me, letting the small movement speak volumes. Maybe it's not the house, she said, her voice low and steady. Maybe it's the company. Her hand rested lightly on my arm, the weight subtle, deliberate, and infinitely comforting. We talked for hours, not about confessions, not about plans, but about the small, ordinary things that made us who we were, books we loved, memories that shaped us, little thoughts and observations we rarely shared with anyone. Each word, each laugh, each fleeting glance became another thread weaving us together, creating a quiet intimacy that felt both tender and profound. At one point, she adjusted the throw on the couch, and I instinctively leaned closer, catching the faint warmth of her shoulder. Her hand brushed against mine again, almost accidentally, and I let my fingers rest over hers. It was nothing rushed, nothing forced. It was a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of connection, of trust, of something delicate and precious. Later, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, a simple gesture that carried the weight of days of quiet tension and mutual understanding. I felt her breathing settle, her heartbeat soft against my chest, and I realized that this gentle, unspoken closeness, was the culmination of everything that had been building between us. It wasn't about passion or urgency. It was about being seen, being understood, and allowing something real to grow at its own pace. I leaned back slightly, resting my head near hers, and let the moment stretch. The room felt suspended in time, the soft light, the warmth between us, the gentle rhythm of shared presence. It was complete, not in the dramatic way movies often show, but in the quiet, fulfilling way that lingers long after the world intrudes. For the first time since I arrived, I felt entirely at ease, comfortable, welcomed, and emotionally full. The house-sitting had begun as a simple favor, but it had become far more, a slow, tender awakening to connection, trust, and intimacy. And as we sat together, hands occasionally brushing, heads leaning close, I knew that what had started with a note on a door had transformed into something quietly, beautifully lasting. The night wrapped around us, and I finally understood, this was the resolution of a story written not in words or gestures alone, but in every lingering glance, every soft touch, every shared silence. It was complete.